Hi everyone, my name is Dina and you're listening to Slavsvidem, a podcast about Slavic languages. In the previous episode, we talked about the verbal aspect in imperative and what implication does it have. Today, we're going to continue speaking about verbal aspect and imperative, but with one additional thing, negation. Before we continue, I would like to remind you that Slavsvidem is a completely self-funded project, which means that any donation counts. If you like what I do, you can support me at www.buymeacoffee.com/Slavsvidem. Thank you very much for your donations. While I was researching for this episode, I came across one sentence that kind of sounded like modern Slavic languages all prefer using imperative when it comes to prohibition. Technically, this is true, but not in all cases and not in all Slavic languages. So, what we're going to be talking about today is the South Slavic group. Those are Bulgarian, Macedonian, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, and Slovene. Before we start with that, let's check out how Old Church Slavonic used to express prohibition. In case you get lost with the aspect and the concept of aspect in Slavic languages, don't worry, it's not an easy thing to understand. The most basic explanation that I can give you here is imperfective, that is, non-finite verbs, are used when the emphasis lies on the duration of the action and when the action itself is more important than its consequence. It's also important that this is a recurring action and that it's not something that happens at one moment and ends immediately. On the other hand, perfective or finite verbs are used when it's a one-time action and the emphasis lies on its consequence, not on the action itself. Okay, now let's check out the Old Church Slavonic. Old Church Slavonic was the first Slavic literary language that dates back to the 9th century. And in that time, the monuments and the written documents that are written tell us something a bit differently from the situation that we have in modern Slavic languages. That is, Old Church Slavonic used both imperfective and perfective verbs when expressing a prohibition. As I mentioned before, perfective is used when the consequence of the action is more important than the action itself, whereas imperfective is used when the duration and the action itself is more important. And this is exactly the logic that Old Church Slavonic used when choosing which aspect of the verb to use in prohibition. Other studies suggest that the time of the event and time of the speech also played a role here. That if those two, the time of the event time, and speech time, if those two happen to co-occur at the same time in the present, or the uterance expresses a general prohibition, one uses non-finite verbs. If the event time is somewhat in the future, that is, not at the same time as the speech time, one uses finite verbs. Now let's take a look at modern Slavic languages and what happens there. The truth is that, yes, most of the Slavic languages prefer using imperfective, that is, non-finite verbs, when expressing a prohibition. The negation is always set before the verb, and the number and the person that is expressed in the verb, it gives us following constructions. The sentence, "don't buy fruit," in Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian would be ne kupuj voće. In Slovene, it would be ne kupuj sadja. In Russian, ne pokupaj frukty. In Czech, ne kupuj ovoce. So as I mentioned before, today we're going to be discussing the South Slavic group and what preferences do they make when it comes to verbal aspect in prohibition. South Slavic languages, that is all of them except Slovene, really follow the path that I mentioned before. They prefer using imperfective, non-finite verbs when it comes to expressing a prohibition. Bosnian Serbian Croatian has two verbs that are exception. Shvatiti, to get, to understand, and zaboraviti, to forget. Those two verbs come in finite form when it comes to prohibition. Don't get me wrong, ne shvati me pogrešno, not ne shvataj me pogrešno. Don't forget what you promised, ne zaboravi šta si obećao, not ne zaboravljaj šta si obećao. In other cases, in order to use a finite verb, one needs what we call a periphrastic prohibition. Periphrastic negative imperative is present in Bulgarian, Macedonian, and Bosnian Serbian Croatian, and is formed by using a particle nemoj in Macedonian and Bosnian Serbian Croatian, and nedaj in Bulgarian, plus particle da, plus finite verb. Listen to the following examples in Bosnian Serbian Croatian to kind of understand the difference. So, a general prohibition that is considered to be more an advice would be, don't buy paper from this man. In Bosnian Serbian Croatian, nemoj da kupuješ novine od ovog čoveka. In one specific situation, one-time thing, when the verb is finite, one would say, don't buy rotten fruit. Nemoj da kupiš pokvareno voće. Now, the thing with using a finite verb in periphrastic negated imperative is that you kind of get the feeling that it's a situation that is already familiar, and it's a situation that already occurred before. So in this case, you want to emphasize that this time, this cannot happen again. In the sentence that I've mentioned before, nemoj da kupiš pokvareno voće, I personally have a feeling that it's something that already happened. So someone sometimes bought rotten fruit, and this time they're at the door, they want to come out and go to the store, and I use this finite verb telling them that in this specific situation, this cannot happen again. Buying rotten fruit cannot happen again. When I said that South Slavic languages, with the exception of Slovene, use non-finite verbs to express prohibitions, I wasn't 100% right. In Bosnian Serbian Croatian, those finite verbs can be found in some biblical texts in a more spiritual manner. For example, in the Ten Commandments, one would read in Bosnian Serbian Croatian, ne ubi, not ne ubijaj, don't kill. In Bulgarian and Macedonian, as well as in other Slavic languages, that would be expressed with non-finite verb. Now, when taking a look at Slovene, both finite and non-finite verbs are to be found when expressing a prohibition. There is no such thing as periphrastic negative imperative in Slovene, so there is only this one particle ne and then the verb in imperative. What I find important to mention here is that in some cases, Slovene really does differ from the South Slavic group and tends to be more similar to the West Slavic languages, that is, Czech and Slovak. And this is exactly one of those cases where Slovene differs. So let's see what that looks like. In the following example, there is a paper by Domen Krvina, who did a study on imperfective and perfective in imperative in modern Slovene. So imperfective would be expressed in the following sentence. Prebrskali ti bodo sobo, zato je pretirano ne pospravljaj. They're going to search through your room, so you don't need to really clean it up now. On the other side, perfective can be found in the following sentence. Pomembno. Pri osteoporozi nikoli ne popite več kot 2 skodelic kave. Important. If you suffer from osteoporosis, do not drink more than 2 cups of coffee a day. So what exactly is the difference here? When do we use finite and when do we use non-finite verb? The first sentence is more of an advice, and it takes the well-being of the hearer into consideration as well. If you remember what I talked about in the previous episode, we kind of have similar situations in Russian with проходите, заходите, раздевайтесь. Those are the kind of things where you use imperfective, and it's more of an advice in a sense. It's not really a prohibition. In this case, it is also more of a general statement. So in any case, if someone is going to search through your room, you don't really have to make an effort and tidy it up. So it works for this particular case as well as in general. What about the second example that we had with coffee and osteoporosis? That is also kind of an advice, but not really. So Krvina states in his article that there are other factors that also influence whether you're going to use a finite or non-finite verb when stating a prohibition. In this sentence, it is a quantitative limitation that plays a crucial role. More than 2 cups a day suggests that there is a quantitative limitation that cannot be exceeded. It is important that you stop after these 2 cups of coffee, which the finite form indicates. The action being done and complete. The action here, drinking coffee. And that is it for today. Join me next time when we're going to talk about East and West Slavic languages and their preferences when it comes to verbal aspect when expressing a prohibition. Thank you very much for listening.